Chapter 8 of Lyddie by Katherine Paterson, excerpted and adapted. Number 5, Concord Corporation. At first, Lyddie thought the clanging noise was the bear, knocking the oatmeal kettle against the furniture back home. Then she opened her eyes as the morning bell continued and began to remember where she was. The tiny attic room of the boarding house came alive. One of the 5 girls in the room struck a stick against a box, creating the flash and odor of a tiny hell. The girl used the stick to light a candle that barely lit the room, still gloomy before dawn. The clatter of 5 girls dressing and squabbling over a single basin of water forced Lyddie fully awake. Last night, Mrs. Bedloe, the coachman's sister, had kindly taken Lyddie in. Lyddie's dress and shawl had been caked in mud. Mrs. Bedloe told her son, a boy about Charlie's age named Tim, to fill a tub of hot water in her own bedroom. Lyddie bathed in Mrs. Bedloe's bedroom and put on her only other dress, bursting at the seams from her growing body. In the meantime, Mrs. Bedloe soaked Lyddie's muddy clothes in a pot of boiling water on the black cook stove in the kitchen. And what a beautiful modern stove it was! When Lyddie entered the kitchen after her bath, she stared at it as though it were an exotic monster from the depths of the sea. Lyddie wanted to pull up a chair and feel its wonderful warmth and admire its design, but Mrs. Bedloe urged her into the dining room for supper. A noisy army of almost 30 young women filled the room, still full of energy after their long workday in the factory. Lyddie was so tired, her head almost dropped into the plate of pork and beans. Mrs. Bedloe put her to bed early, helping her up the 4 flights of stairs to her new room. Lyddie could barely mumble her thanks for the woman's kindness before she was asleep. And now Lyddie lay awake in her bed on this first morning of her new life. After 3 bumpy days traveling in the stagecoach and sharing a bed last night with a strange girl who tossed and snored, she was glad to lay in silence in the empty attic. The other 4 girls who shared this room had already gone downstairs. The morning bell and the shrieks and squeals had made her think of how peaceful her old, tiny room at Cutler's had been. But she would not look back. She threw off the quilt. She pulled on her too small homespun dress and her stockings that had been redarned many times. She padded down the 4 flights of stairs to join the other girls in the dining room for breakfast. "Hello there," a voice cut through the din. "We didn't really meet you." The room was suddenly quiet. "Don't be rude, Betsy," another said. "She was tired last night." Lyddie turned to see who had said this last, because it was her idea of a lady's voice. The young woman who had spoken was smiling. "You only came in last night, didn't you, my dear?" Lyddie nodded. "There, don't be shy. We were all new once, even our Betsy." There was a titter from the rest. "I'm Amelia Kate." Her name was aristocratic. Amelia. It suited her. She was almost as pretty as the lady in pink that had come through the inn last year. Her skin was white and her face and hands long and delicate. And she was respected, or the others wouldn't have stopped chattering when she spoke. "And you?" "Lydia Worthen." With a rough finger she scratched at the tight homespun across her chest. It seemed to Lyddie that the room was full of young women, all well-dressed, all delicate, all beautiful. and she a crow among peacocks. The girls had no work in the factory at the moment because the water in the Merrimack River had gotten too high to turn the mill wheels quickly enough to operate the machinery. So, after breakfast, Amelia and a girl from Vermont named Prudence Allen offered to take Lydia shopping for a proper dress, work apron, shoes, and bonnet. Lyddie had only the money she had borrowed from Tryphena, but Mrs. Bedloe gave her $1. "It's payment for how my brother let you muddy your dress to get the stagecoach unstuck," she said. Lyddie was alarmed that it took all the money she had to get the new clothing, but her new city boots fit better than any she had worn in her life. Amelia persuaded Mrs. Bedloe that since Lyddie had no relatives or friends in the house or the city, she needed their particular caring. Mrs. Bedloe still felt guilty about her brother allowing Lyddie to get the stagecoach unstuck without his help, so she agreed. Lyddie was moved to a bedroom on the 3rd floor to be with Amelia, Prudence, and Betsy. One of the 2 double beds was shared by Amelia and Prudence. Betsy was alone in the other, because the previous girl had left to go home, so Lyddie would share that bed with Betsy. The room was better than being in the attic room of 5 girls, and some of the girls in the house grumbled about the new girl getting such a nice choice. Still, Lyddie's new room was cramped. There were 2 tiny nightstands, various trunks belonging to the girls, and no place to sit except on the double beds. However, there wasn't much need to spend time sitting in the bedroom. On a regular workday, there was no leisure time except less than 3 hours between supper and curfew. Most girls spent this free time down in the parlor/dining room or out in town where there were shops, lectures, and even dances, all run by honest citizens who each wanted the working girls to spend their wages at their business. The next morning, Mrs. Bedloe led Lyddie down the street past all the corporation boarding houses to the bridge that led to the factory complex. Between 2 low brick buildings was a tall wooden fence. The gate of the fence was locked, like a jail yard, but Mrs. Bedloe wasn't deterred. She simply went to the door of one of the low buildings and walked in. Lyddie followed, dragging her feet, for the room they entered was larger than the main floor of Cutler's Tavern, and it was crowded with tables and scriveners' desks. There were a few men working about the huge room, who looked up over their pens and account books as the 2 women passed, but it was clear that nothing much was being accomplished, even in the counting room, now that the water was too high to drive the mill wheel. She signed the paper where the clerk pointed, tried to listen carefully to all his warnings about what the contract demanded, and stuffed the broadside that he handed her into her apron pocket. She would study it tonight, she decided, her heart sinking. She could tell at a glance that it would be almost impossible for her to make out the meaning of such a paper. Oh, if only Charlie were here to read it aloud to her and explain the long words. Factory girls were not supposed to be ignorant, it would seem. It would be several months before she could read with ease the regulations for the boarding houses of the Concord Corporation. But she found out the next day that it concealed unpleasant truths. The first of these was the vaccination. Mrs. Bedloe marched her over to the hospital after dinner, where a doctor cruelly gouged her leg and poured a mysterious liquid directly into the wound. This would prevent her from catching smallpox. One day, the announcement was made at supper that the factory work was to begin again. Mrs. Bedloe walked Lyddie over to the factory weaving room after noonday dinner. The gate was locked. "They don't want tardy girls slipping past," Mrs. Bedloe explained. "You must always take care to be here when the bell rings." They entered the factory complex through the counting room as they had 2 weeks before, but this time it was teeming with men, all dressed like gentlemen. Every head seemed to rise, and every eye looked their way. Despite her new clothes, Lyddie could feel the shame burning through her rough brown cheeks. She ducked her bonneted head and hurried through as fast as she could, almost shoving Mrs. Bedloe in her haste. Once in the yard, she was acutely aware of the thudding. The pulse of the factory boomed through the massive brick wall, and she could feel the vibrations of the machinery as they made their way up the shadowy wooden staircase, which clung for dear life to the side of the building. On the 4th floor, Mrs. Bedloe yanked open the door. The room was filled with a roaring sound. "Mr. Marsden is expecting you," she shouted, and gave Lyddie a little push into the room.